Hi, my name is Lawrence Price, and today I'd like to talk to you from Nehemiah chapter 3, verse 5. And today's thought is really around connecting to the burden. And the verse reads as follows: And next unto them, the Tekoites repaired, but their nobles put not their necks to the work of their Lord. So here in chapter 3, Nehemiah takes the time to list all of the people who helped to rebuild the 12 gates of Jerusalem. However, here in verse 5, he highlights this one group who did not participate, the nobles of Tekoa. According to his record, this is the only group of people who refused to help. And Nehemiah lists all sorts of people who did help, both men and women, artisans and laborers, common people and princes. Nehemiah does not tell us why these specific people did not help. We don't know if they were prideful and perhaps thought the work was beneath them. Were they skeptical and thought the project would be unsuccessful? Were they afraid, concerned that their involvement would trigger some type of attack? Whatever their reason, it was not consequential to Nehemiah. The only thing that truly mattered was that they were unwilling to join in. This passage, I think, is a reminder to us. These nobles in action has been recorded to their shame. And we have to ask ourselves, how will our names be recorded? Will we be listed among those who helped, or will be listed among those who refused to join in? Let me share with you just a brief illustration from my own personal life. Early in my ministry, I served at the New Hope Missionary Baptist Church in Radcliffe, Kentucky. The pastor at the time was Reverend O.C. Jones, and he was also the founding pastor of the church. And he had led several building projects to support the ministry there. And when I was working with him, he was in the beginning phases of building a family life center that would eventually become the centerpiece of the community. One day, he and I were just talking about leadership and his challenges with getting people to support the project. And during this conversation, he provided some insight and wisdom that has just really been guiding me and stuck with me ever since. He said to me, "Lawrence, people don't follow you because of a speech or because of a title. They will follow you only when they see the shovel in your hand and you doing the work with your own hands. When you do that, people will follow, pick up their own shovels, and join you in the work." Nehemiah certainly believed this. He had the same perspective. He is listed among those people who helped to rebuild. And as God works through his people, will you follow the examples of Nehemiah and Reverend Jones, or will you follow the examples of the nobles from Tekoa? To kind of start and kind of lay some of the context here, I really wanted to kind of take you to Nehemiah chapter 1. And this first point I want to emphasize is about weep, mourn, and pray. In Nehemiah 1, verse 4, it says, "And it came to pass when I heard these words that I sat down and wept, and mourned certain days, and fasted, and prayed before the God of heaven." Nehemiah writes his book in the first person. His book opens up with a question about the condition of the Jews in his homeland, and he discovers that they're both suffering and are vulnerable. And as a result, Nehemiah mourns and he prays. He speaks to God as if their sins were his own. He identifies with them. Although he did not share their hardships, he placed himself into physical discomfort. Nehemiah shows us how we should care for one another. Upon hearing the suffering of others that had come from sin, he did not engage in piling on. He did not criticize them. He did not gossip about it. He wept, fasted, and prayed. When was the last time we wept for a brother or sister? When was the last time we talked to God about someone instead of talking about them to someone else? And furthermore, Nehemiah identified with them. He considered their sin to be his sin. He considered their suffering to be his own. Only in my closest relationships do I feel this way. My wife, my children. But what about others? Do I mourn with those who mourn? Do I only see someone's problems as their problem? While I carry the burden of others. In this sense, Nehemiah just didn't sympathize. He empathized with others. The second point I want to emphasize when we're setting the context here in the early chapters of Nehemiah is that we need to be faithful even when we're afraid and sad. Nehemiah chapter 2 verse 3 reads, "And said unto the king, Let the king live forever. Why should not my countenance be sad, when the city, the place of my father's sepulchres, lieth waste, and the gates thereof are consumed with fire?" When we get to chapter 2, it's been about 3 to 4 months since Nehemiah first heard about Jerusalem, and he is still grieving. Nehemiah's job is to be the cupbearer for the king. He was responsible for serving the king's wine and basically for having a cheerful disposition. However, his sorrowful disposition catches the king's attention. This should have resulted in his immediate death. His sadness would have made the king think his wine was poisoned. So instead of death, however, the king gives him favor. He exalts him to be the governor of Jerusalem, and he also gives him the materials needed to rebuild the city. Nehemiah describes the city ruin as the tomb of his fathers, as a place empty of protection because the gates have been burned. It's a place dear to him that is now open to the wanton actions of enemies. Nehemiah walked with God and was fearful. His faith did not drive away his emotions. Instead, his faith kept him moving forward despite those emotions. We have to ask ourselves the question, what is our Jerusalem? What is it that causes us to have faith in God even while we are overwhelmed with fear and sadness? Perhaps it's a child or a close friend. Perhaps it's our health. It could be our finances, not knowing how we'll make it to see tomorrow. In these moments, we should look at Nehemiah as an example. Even when we are fearful and sad, we must still hold on to our faith. And this brings us to chapter 3 and the overall message around connecting to the burden. When beginning the work, Nehemiah led the people to repair the 12 gates of the city. The gates are listed in counterclockwise order. For those of that have studied passages around the end times, you can readily see the relationship between Nehemiah's description and the New Jerusalem. And as I mentioned before, only one group at one of the gates refused to help, the rich people of Tekoa. Nehemiah says that they refused to put their necks to work. This was a way of saying that they refused to put on a yoke. A yoke is a frame that connects an animal or a person to a burden. It allows them to pull that burden. These people refused the burden, and Nehemiah called them out for it. Like Nehemiah, our Lord is recording. He is recording those that work. He is recording the names of those who don't. Later in his book, Nehemiah writes that the people had in mind to work. And I love this phrasing. I pray this over my family each weekday. I ask God to give them such a mind as they get up each morning. Today, I ask it for all of us. I pray that each of us is willing to take up the yoke, to be willing to take on the burden, and to shoulder the load that has been set before us. I pray that this has been a blessing to you, just insight from the early chapters of the book of Nehemiah, and that is an encouragement to you to always lean into the things that God has called you to do, that you set aside the things that might distract you, and that you are willing to connect to the burden and be there to help pull the load. May God bless you and may God keep you. Thank you.